Welcome to Formed, where each week we navigate a relevant topic or question through honest conversations. We are three pastors with three different backgrounds on staff together at Irving Bible Church in Irving, Texas. We believe we are constantly being formed in the way of Jesus for the sake of the world, and we hope this podcast helps with that. So let's jump into this week's episode of Formed. Welcome back to another week of Formed, and we are 2 days past Election Day. What a crazy day Tuesday was.
What a crazy day it was. We're recording on Tuesday, so we have no idea.
It's still Tuesday.
I hope this is okay to be joking a couple of days
I
later.
know.
Yeah, we don't know what's going to happen. So
Yeah.
Barb, I love my wife and just how she approaches life. But it was last night. She was like, "I'm just so glad tomorrow night it'll just all be over." I was like, "Well, all right. I'm hoping that we can all just turn the page, but I don't know if it's all just going to be over in one day." So we are back for another week in our Let's Talk About It series, and this is a series where we've been taking questions from you guys, the listeners, from people that are here on a Sunday, as we've been kind of partnering this podcast series with our sermon series that's going on right now about these kind of bigger topics that we're all talking about in our families and friend groups and around dinner tables and restaurants and stuff. And so this is kind of like the post episode after a Sunday morning. This past Sunday, you taught on relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it was a special Sunday here.
Yeah, we had our Thanks for the Nations, and so we were really celebrating just the reality of the diversity of the body of Christ and our particular expression of that.
Yeah.
You read the scriptures and you see from Genesis to Revelation God's heart for the nations. And especially here in our community in Irving, Texas, the nations are here. It's not about going to faraway places. It's about the reality that there is this beautiful ethnic diversity, cultural diversity that's right here in our surrounding community that more and more is finding expression here within our church community. We just take a one Sunday a year to kind of celebrate that, and thought that talking about relationships on that particular Sunday was a fitting topic to how do we form these deep, life-changing relationships with people who are profoundly different than us. And yet the topic of relationships is one that's, I think, universally applicable. And even the connection between what we've talked about so far with politics and mental health and technology, the relational component of each one of those, right? How each one of those bears on relationships and how relationships bear on each one of those topics is really important to consider.
Yeah, and I was going to say, too, before we jump all the way into relationships and some of the questions submitted, we are 2 days post-election. It could be crazy right now. We're recording this on Tuesday, we said. This comes out on Thursday. If you are looking for resources or just that conversation on faith and politics, and you're asking some big questions around that, we have some past episodes. A few weeks ago, we did an episode on politics in the church. We have a sermon from a few weeks ago that you can find that on YouTube. We have an episode last year that we did, I think it's Politics and Faith. With Caitlin, that so many of you guys loved that conversation. So we have some stuff here that you want to go back to this week and listen to. You can surely do that. So let's jump back. Let's do relationships. Let's jump back to a statistic that you used this past Sunday. I think especially post-COVID, there has been this, and you can quote this epidemic of loneliness. Yeah. What is that stat, and where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, so the idea of calling loneliness an epidemic is something that our U.S. Surgeon General actually in 2023 talked about, the idea that we are suffering from an epidemic of loneliness. And the American Psychiatric Association released a study in January of this year that said that 30% of the U.S. population, about 1 in every 3 people, has experienced loneliness several times in the last week, with 10% of the population saying they experience loneliness every day. And of course, loneliness, the part of the reason why it's an epidemic is not just how widespread it is, but how deeply impactful it is. I mean, studies have been done that talk about the health impact, the physical health impact of our experience of loneliness, and it's as negative in its consequence for our physical health as some other, terrible kinds of practices, cigarette smoking,
something like
that.
smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Is as impactful as like loneliness. Yeah, which is crazy when you think about it like that.
Why do you think loneliness has become such an epidemic with us now?
Yeah, I mean,
why is it so easy, I guess?
One thing is, I think the pandemic, I think this was always there, but I think the pandemic really brought it to the surface with everything that we experienced. But couple things. I think one, increasingly, we find our social interaction online and less face-to-face. Some of that is social media, and we are more connected than ever before, but our connection's so superficial. Right? Like we have, 1,500 friends on Facebook or these many Instagram followers, and that's great, but it's a very superficial connection. You know where they went to dinner or where they went on vacation, but you never really feel deeply known. No one knows your hopes and dreams and your fears, your anxieties, and so that there's that sense of loneliness that brings about. And then I think even the way we work has changed, and this I think has increased because of the pandemic with remote work. Again, that decline in face-to-face interaction. Zoom is great, and it's a wonderful technology for giving us that flexibility and our ability to adapt to the situations that we've been in. And yet it prevents that face-to-face interaction that's so necessary to feel connected, truly connected to people. So I think that's part of it. I think also more and more we've become this culture that is mobile and transitory. And so I see this a lot with our young adult population, but for lots of people, and again, post-pandemic, this has even increased where we move around so much. 50 years ago, people lived and worked in the same community. And so they were able to put down deep roots, and now you move every couple years. It could be for work. It could be for personal reasons, lots of reasons. And so some people may move to a location and think, I'm only going to be here for a couple years or maybe a few months. And so do I really want to do the hard work of investing in relationships? Or so that not being able to put down deep roots, I think also causes that as well. So those are a couple reasons I thought about.
I mean, I think, part of what you alluded to is what I was talking about even earlier about the connection of these topics that we've covered so far. So I think politics, mental health, and technology all have bearing on why this increase in loneliness. Politics, we're living in this increasingly contentious, divisive kind of cultural environment, and we sort of withdraw to our tribes of like-minded thinkers, and yet some of the bonds that have held us in relationships, familial bonds, geographic bonds, get frayed in this divisive, contentious kind of political environment. I mean, when you have family members who struggle to maintain relationship because of their deep-seated political differences, mental health, with the rise, the increase of anxiety and depression, some of those struggles tend to cause people to withdraw and isolate more and more, that they don't have that place where they can be safe and known and felt. And so, so there's a almost a chicken or egg sort of how much do our relational fraying contribute to struggles with mental health? How much do struggles with mental health
which
contribute
first,
to eroding those relational ties? But I think the two are absolutely connected. And then, as you talked about, just technology, that the more and more we are broadly connected through our devices, the more shallow I think oftentimes those connections become. And we wind up, I mean, I just got back from a lunch where I accidentally left my phone on my desk, and it was so great because I was not one time tempted to fub this person, right? To phone snub this person, of the term that we introduced last week talking about technology. It wasn't buzzing in my pocket.
Your screen time is going
to go down considerably.
Woodbur's like, how do I function on this? So, okay, what if you like being alone? Like, what if we're talking about being like lonely and loneliness, and somebody's like, hey, I kind of prefer being alone. Do we have to have relationships?
So I think the short answer is we were made for relationships. I don't think it's wrong to want to be alone. I think that's really healthy, actually. You need both. And Bonhoeffer talked about that, right? So you need both, but I do think that the way we're created is we were wired for a relationship. So God is a community, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, and as his image bearers, he's made us, he's designed us for community in that way. And so not only are we created for it, but it's also how we're formed. And so it's part of our spiritual formation that our character is formed by the people we're around. I think there's that line, that stat that you're the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. Right? So think about that. You're formed by your relationships. Your character's formed. Your virtues of love and joy and patience and humility comes in the context of relationships. And if the end goal of a disciple is to be more like Jesus, to become a person of love, that happens in the context of community. So it's spiritual, it's necessary for our spiritual formation. It's how we're wired. And it's how God is designed us to grow as well. It's such an important part of how the Lord is going to work in us. I mean, think about where you have been most sort of chiseled and all the rough edges polished is in the context of relationships where you have to do sacrifice for one another, love one another in these places. And so I think those are how I'd respond to that.
I'm 100% in alignment with you on that we were made to know and to be known, to love and to be loved, to experience that embrace of the other. It's part of the way that God has wired us. And as I talked about on Sunday, the reason behind that is we are made in the image of an us, right? Let us make mankind in our image. John, the Gospel of John opens with this idea, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, that at the base of all reality is a relationship, the relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so it is out of the overflow of that love that is shared within the community that is the Trinity that all creation comes into existence, and we are made in the image of a communal or relational triune God. So we're made for that sense of connection, belonging, and then we're formed into that. You think about spiritual formation, we talk about it as becoming more and more like Jesus, becoming more and more like the one who has saved us. And what you see in Jesus' life is, on the one hand, that pattern of withdrawal that Jesus needs, desires, craves that aloneness with the Father. And so too, we ought to have regular patterns of solitude in our lives. And yet then you also see Jesus engaging with the world around him, and then engaging in intimate community with the few that were gathered around him. And I think that's what God wants for us, that we would be people who cultivate silence and solitude to be with him, and people who are deeply relationally connected, like the pattern of Jesus. I mentioned Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer talks about, let he who cannot be alone beware of community, and let he who can't be in community beware of being alone. These two things, like they both are part of the life that God intends for us.
Yeah. Both of those are important rhythms in life. I always think that if the Son of God needed to have community, then how much more do I, right? Because anyone... Yeah.
And I was thinking about the fact, I used to work overseeing kind of a small group program for spiritual formation with students in the seminary. And sometimes we would get students that would kind of bristle at being forced into a community, and they would say, I don't need this community. And there's another way of thinking about it. What if this community needs you?
Yeah, that's good.
Right? And so it's not only those relationships are for my good, for my formation, but I actually have something to contribute to the others that are a part of this relationship as well.
I saw this diagram the other day, and it was like the amount of friends I had in high school or like middle school, high school, college, and then like as an adult, and the groups got smaller as it went along. Why do you think it is harder for relationships to happen when you're older compared to when we're in like middle school and high school? We're like, I feel like I have friends everywhere, and now relationships are like very limited.
It's a great question.
Yeah, it is a good question.
I hope you figured it out.
Sissy's got it.
I don't know if I figured it out.
pressure.
I have some thoughts. So one, I think on a really superficial surface level is one, as you get older, you have more responsibilities. And so family and career and maybe personal goals that you're achieving. So that those things take time and intentionality and hard work. And so I think there in some ways you might consider, well, life's just busier, life's more complex. And so I don't have as much time to have as friends. I think that's certainly true. And yet I think that's kind of a surface level issue. I think deeper than that, one of the things like, I think about college as like this high point of when it was just like the easiest time to make friends. Well, why was that? And I think it's because you think about your younger days, college or high school or whatever it is, there's this social almost structure that's set up where you're all in the same stage of life. You're all together. And so you have that opportunity to develop relationships in that way. And then you also have more shared experiences where, you're on this sports team or you're working on this project together. And I think there's still opportunities for that as adults. It's just fewer.
Yeah.
So, work might be a place you do that. Or I think this, again, is a reason for our loneliness. There's been a decline in third spaces where people would have some of those shared experiences. And so, first space, so the idea of third space is first space is home, second space is work. Third space are those places of social connection like church or a club or a civic organization. And more people are involved in those kinds of things. And so that idea of shared experience gets lost. Whereas when you were younger, I just think there are more opportunities for that.
Yeah.
I think also just as you age, you have more and more experiences with relationships that result in pain and maybe betrayal and rejection. And as you kind of build those up, you get a little bit more jaded.
Yeah.
And you become wary of being vulnerable and putting yourself out there. So I think
There
that
can
happens
be
as
a
well.
kind of impulse towards self-protection.
Yes.
Whether that's self-protection of my time and energy, right? I
it's true.
told a little bit of a kind of playful story on Sunday about my recliner at home, right? And that that can actually be a place that I hide from relationship, that I hide from the world. That I'm actually self-protecting my time and energy by going to that place of kind of isolation and withdrawal. But there is also a self-protection of the heart of like, I'm not sure I really want to put myself out there with the possibility of actually this being something that is hard or is hurtful, right? And so, and what's interesting is, again, you go all the way back to the story in the garden, like part of what's happening in this story of the fall, this story that just, I think, makes so much sense out of the relationships that we experience. There is that tendency to try to hide from one another, to self-protect. And part of a relationship is pressing past that impulse towards self-protection.
Yeah.
You kind of answered this, I think, but since you touched on this, and it makes me think of this question of some of the hardest pain in my life is because of relationships. It feels like the closer I get to someone, the more hurt I will eventually be. Why should I fight for relationships?
Yeah.
No.
You want to start?
I think my first impulse is just a response of empathy, of recognizing to voice that in a question is to voice a place of deep pain.
Yes.
And it's one that I certainly can relate to, right? That I've had my share of grief that comes from broken relationships, and that can then lead to that impulse towards self-protection. But it's where I come back to that wonderful line from C.S. Lewis, who says, "To love at all is to be vulnerable." Right? If you don't want to be vulnerable, then you're going to have to protect your heart in such a way that you wall it off from the world. But then he implies the idea that then becomes your tomb, your casket, right? Where your heart dies because of that disconnection. So you have to be willing to be vulnerable. And again, the story in the garden, I think part of what's going on there is just the reality that vulnerability isn't necessarily something that we do. It is something that is true of who we are, of what we are. We are all, in our own ways, vulnerable.
Yeah.
It's a matter of whether I will allow you into that, whether I will let you see it, whether I will let you experience. And I'm reading a really powerful book right now called Healing What's Within by Chuck DeGroat. And he's going back to the story of the garden and looking at those questions that God asks of Adam and Eve. Where are you? Who told you you were naked? Did you eat from the tree? And it's just a beautiful reflection. And he uses this little phrase that he talks about, we become habituated to a life of disconnection. And I think that can be so true of us. And again, it oftentimes is out of that impulse of self-protection. And yet, the real, full, vibrant human life that I think Jesus calls us to, the richness of life that Jesus calls us to, is one lived in the context of relationship, which inevitably implies a certain amount of risk.
Yeah.
It inevitably implies vulnerability.
Yeah, so good. Yeah, I mean, I would say the same thing. I think this is, I've really loved this question because I could even sense the pain that's involved in that. I can, again, empathize with that. So my first thing would be say, I'm just so sorry that you experienced that pain, because I can understand why that would make you apprehensive of relationships and taking that risk. And yet I would say take the risk. You said something to this effect on Sunday as well, that our deepest wounds are often in the context of relationships, but so is our deepest healing.
Yes.
And I think that is so true. I've been deeply hurt in relationships, but I've also hurt others deeply in relationships. And at the very same time, I think I found some of the deepest healing in the context of relationships. And so I think both is true. And it does require a level of vulnerability and trust and taking a risk. And I know that is so, so hard. I can totally understand why that's the case. And I would still say it's so worth it. Because to be fully human is to that's done in the context of community, in the context of relationships. And I think relationships are worth fighting for, because when we fight for relationships, we fight for the person we're becoming, right? Because relationships are part of the way God is forming us. And so when we fight for relationships, we fight for the person we're becoming, in that we're becoming these people that are open-handed and open-hearted and vulnerable and willing to trust. And it's in the giving and receiving of love that happens. And so I just think it's
so good.
really valuable.
Yeah. The way I said it on Sunday, we are created from and for relationship.
That's good. Yeah.
And our wounds are healed and our lives are transformed in the context of relationships.
Barry, this one might be more directed towards you.
Uh-oh.
How can an introvert have good good relationships?
I was trying to figure out which question you had.
Seriously. That's not possible. So no. I think introverts love relationships and are good at relationships. It's just the reality that it's all about energy, right? To be an introvert is to say to be with people drains me of my energy. Well, sometimes that's a good thing to experience and enjoy. I spent 3 hours Sunday evening with a friend who's kind of just going through some stuff, and this was after a long weekend of ministry, and I was tired. I was exhausted. I was praying, Lord, help me to be fully present in this experience. And I was exhausted when it was over, and it was so rich, and it was so good. And I'm so glad that I showed up. And we connected deeply in this conversation about some heavy stuff. And so I think introverts can be great at relationships. It's just the recognition that being with people is draining. And so I need to have appropriate kind of replenishment so that I can actually show up in relationships. And it's just the recognition that my circle of relationships is probably going to be smaller. Kim, my wife, is an extrovert, and she has a much larger circle of relationships than I do. I have all these social spaces that my role requires me to sort of show up in, and yet I have a relatively small circle of people that I'm really close to. But introverts treasure that small circle.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree that introverts can be really good friends. One, I think it's what you said. I think it's pursuing depth over quantity. Like, you don't have to be the life of the party or have 1,000 friends, but if you can, again, just be intentional with who are those few that you can go deep with. Because I think introverts are really good with going deep one-on-one or in small group settings. So thinking about that, and then thinking about how can you be intentional. I think a lot of times we're so afraid to pursue people in that way that if I meet somebody, I'm like, well, you know what? They're kind of interesting. I think we might have some things in common to take the risk and do the lunch or the coffee or whatever it is. I think another great way, and this is not just for introverts, but for all of us to develop friendships, is to serve together. That it's often like when we serve together, that's such a bonding experience. And oftentimes you might have a shared passion, and that even already gives you common ground to talk about and engage with. Like I'm really passionate about mentoring at-risk youth. Well, you find another person who's also doing that, you've already got something in common. So I think that's a great way to do that too. And then I'd also say to just be patient, because relationships do take time. They are organic. And so you can't force it, but you can be intentional about it. And so I think that's important as well.
That's good.
And I was thinking about the role that social media has played on relationships nowadays. And I was thinking of a conversation I had the other day with somebody on staff who has a teenage daughter, and how her daughter has these like Snapchat conversations going on with their friends a lot, and then they'll get in person
And they don't talk.
and they like barely talk, where it's like socially awkward. And it's like, oh, this is different, like compared to. So how has like social media like changed relationships both for the good and the worse?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about that a little last week, was technology, right? And we're all running together about how, I mean, that is one of the reasons I would advocate for delaying giving your child a smartphone as much as possible, or access to social media, because you want them to develop those in-person, face-to-face relationships before they start developing sort of all the online relationships. Because it's true, right now, people do a majority of their relationships oftentimes just over text or Snapchats or whatever it is. And so thinking through, how do you make space for those face-to-face conversations and that time, and being intentional about that, because and I think the online realm is great. There's really important ways that that's helpful to connection, and yet it leads to much more superficial, surface level way of doing relationships.
Yeah, I think about a few years ago now, a colleague in ministry here who her father passed away, and just a conversation with her, after that experience happened, and just lamenting the fact that she said, I got beautiful text messages and email messages and even a few phone calls or voicemails, but nobody just showed up and sat with me and cried with me. And I think that's emblematic of is that this kind of mediated connection is actually easier. It's easier than showing up. And because it's easier, it's what we sort of default to.
Yeah.
But because it's easier doesn't mean it's better. And so sometimes we actually have to press past that, what the technology allows, and to just recognize that is forming me. And so I try to be really mindful of that, of like, am I reaching for the sort of the easy connection, but neglecting the actually deeper, richer, truer kind of connection that comes by showing up, and then showing up and being fully present in the present, right? Because our devices take us out of being present in the present. And so how can I be here with this person and really be fully present here and now?
Yeah. Well,
but you did ask about, I'll throw you did say, but what's the good side? So sometimes Kim and I are sitting in different parts of the house and we're sending Instagram reels back and forth to each other, and those are all a bid for connection, right?
Yes.
What it's called, pebbling or something like that. That's throwing a little pebble out there. That's a bid for connection.
Right.
So that's fun, as long as
There's
we're not
actual
making that our our main
Is that
form of
the only time y'all
communication.
talk?
Yeah. Kim and I pretty much only we actually talk.
So I feel like I do have that moment with Barb. Barb's like, hey, did you see that reel I sent you? I'm like, oh, no, I haven't yet. And it's like, all right, let me go look at it.
You failed the bid for connection.
I know, I did fail it. So that wraps up this week on relationships. Next week, Sissy's up to preach this Sunday.
Yeah.
So let's do this. We're excited. I shouldn't make any jokes about this week.
Yeah, we should.
They might not age well.
I know. Let's do some banter. Some fun part of this. So back a long time ago, actually, the company that I was doing sports writing for, they also had like a pop culture side, and I took this like one freelance assignment to write the top 50 duos in like movie history.
Nice.
It was
Okay.
like just movies, not
Yeah.
TV shows.
Nice.
And I took it and I was like, I'll take some extra money. Way harder than what I
Yeah.
thought it was going to
Yeah.
be, and having to write a certain word count for each duo. And I'm like, what did I do?
Right.
Why did I do this? So anyway, I was like, relationships. What are your top 5
Top 5.
movie / TV show like duos friendships?
Were we supposed to rank them?
I know
I
you don't
ranked
have to
them.
rank
I
them.
ranked
I
them.
ranked them,
Yeah.
but both of us agreed that we spent more time prepping for this part
This
of this
question,
episode
yeah.
than the rest of it.
I'm curious to see if we have any overlap between
Yeah.
some of
I
us.
think we might have one, maybe one.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
You-
expecting one overlap
Yeah.
with you, Barry.
Okay. We may all 3 overlap on
Yeah.
that one.
Okay,
All right,
who wants to go first?
You go first.
Barry
Okay.
goes first.
My number 5. I'm
This is
thinking
also
this
the only reason
this
he
is-
needed his
yeah.
notebook.
This is,
No, it's
this
only
is the
though he's
one
opened
that,
it.
This is the one that Isaac might go. Who is that?
Oh no.
Mulder and Scully.
Mulder and Scully.
X-Files.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
Way to go.
That's a good
So
one.
it's
That's
definitely a
good.
dated reference at this point, a Gen X.
Did they ever
But,
actually date in that show?
You know,
I don't-
did they? Did
Okay.
they
Yeah,
not?
that's the whole
I don't
point of,
know.
like,
yeah. Number 4, and there's something that just feels wrong about this being number 4, but it's kind of where it fell in my ranking, and that would be Frodo and Sam.
Oh, that I had Frodo. and
Yeah,
Sam.
you got
I
a little
did
Frodo
too.
and Sam. Yeah,
I love that
but
duo.
I feel bad for putting them at number 4,
Yeah.
but at number 3,
Okay.
Ron and Harry. So this is
Whoa,
definitely
yeah.
the influence of raising
Yeah.
children in our home. But I mean, we spent lots of time watching the Harry Potter movies.
I thought you were gonna say Taylor and Travis. And I was
Yeah.
like,
I'm not sure how I feel about the Taylor Travis thing. So number 2, I really struggled whether it was going to be Luke and Leia, Han and Leia, R2-D2 and C-3PO, Luke and Obi-Wan, but I think at the end of the day, it's got to be
Han and Chewbacca?
Han and Chewie.
yeah.
Come on.
Han and Chewbacca.
I would have picked.
You had that one
At
too.
number
I didn't
2.
have that. I knew he would have it, so I was like, I'm not putting it on my list.
And
That was
number
the
1, Jed and Leo, The West Wing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, that's my number 1.
I should have known
Jed
that's
Bartlett
your number one.
and Leo McGarry.
Yes, that's
I
good.
literally went to write down Jed and Leo, and I was like,
Yeah.
yeah, he'll have it.
Yeah.
But I did write down Han and Chewie.
Han
though.
and Chewie.
Han and Chewie I thought about, but I didn't put them down. All right, mine are not in order, and mine are so random.
I know. I'm so excited for this.
All right, Joey and Chandler.
Nice. I considered it. Yep.
'Cause I
So
think
wait,
Definitely
so
another
they're-
Gen X reference.
So they were the closest.
they were the
They
closest.
were
I also
roommates.
feel like I have relationships like that where like I just Anyway, I'm not gonna go into who's Joey and who's Chandler. I think I'll offend some people, but yes, I think they were the closest, and I like appreciate their banter and all of that. So
Yeah.
I put them. I did have Frodo and Sam. Okay, here's another one. Will Smith and Martin Lawrence in Bad Boys.
Oh my gosh.
Nice.
That's
good. Nice.
And then I have 2 older ones. Because the first one I thought about was Lucy and Ethel. And I was like, I can't put that. That's so old. Like, I can't do that.
like,
But
I
was
Love
like, it's
Lucy?
a classic.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I
We
love
definitely
Lucy.
had some. Yeah, I Love Lucy playing reruns when we were kids.
Yeah, I
black and
watched
white.
that all the time when I
Yeah,
was a
after,
kid.
After school.
I thought about Andy and Barney.
Nice.
You thought-
That's
oh,
a-
yeah,
that's
that-
I thought
That's
a
about it.
good duo.
And then I put Bert and Ernie.
Nice.
Oh, that's good.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's a good one. I'm
Yeah.
jealous I didn't think of that.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, those are mine. Those are my
Okay.
5.
I had
good.
Frodo and Sam. I had Han and Chewie. I had Buzz and Woody.
Yeah,
Nice.
that's a good one.
I definitely thought about that for
Me
my
too.
kids' generation,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah.
This one's just because we've been watching a lot lately. Tom and Jerry.
Tom and Jerry's a good one. Yeah.
Yep.
And then this one's probably a random one for
Number
y'all that
one.
you're like, why? Now, I wouldn't say it's number 1, but I had Frodo and Sam 1.
Okay.
Andy and Red from Shawshank Redemption.
Yeah, that's a
good
that's
one.
Great.
I know
yeah.
it's kind of a random one,
That's
No,
but
it's a
great.
good one.
I just
I
love
love
that
it.
movie.
Yeah, that's a great
good
movie.
It's always on TV too,
Uh-huh.
and anytime
Yep.
it's on,
Always
I'm
on
like,
TBS,
all right,
yeah.
I got to click on, see what
Oh,
part we're
that's
at.
great.
Yeah.
So there you go.
There you
That's
go.
exactly what you wanted to hear this week was the top
Put your
duos.
top 5 in the comments.
Yes.
Give us
yes.
what
We'd love
do
to
we
see
send
it.
us
We'd
your
love to
top
see
five.
who did we leave out.
Stop us on Sunday and
Who
tell
got
us
snubbed.
who we forgot about.
Yeah.
And maybe it's Barry and Sissy. It's the top duo right
Green
here.
sofa people.
All right, we'll be back next week, and make sure you submit your questions through the description, the link in the description, or scan the QR code in service this week. See you next Thursday.